What is up, fellow modelers? We are building the Revell Kingfisher. This used to be a monogram kit, but Revell reboxed it just like most of their stuff. So we're going to get straight into this unboxing. This kit is typical of any Revell or monogram kit, and it features a lot of moderately detailed interior and exterior raised panel lines, no recessed panel lines other than the ailerons and control surfaces, and as usual, pretty good decals. This kit, you're able to build two different versions of it. One is a yellow pre-war type of version, and the other is the one that I'm building today, one which served in the war. So as we open up these parts, this is one of the series of monogram that is less toyish and has a lot more details in the interior. Now this kit does have raised panel lines, but I go about doing a few tricks here and there to really show them in this video. The interior has a lot of great detail actually for a monogram kit, more than most, so that's a good feature that this kit also has too. The plastic actually has molded seat belts and a lot of raised details, but the instrument panel is a flat surface with a decal though. That's like the only negative that I saw with this kit. And as you can tell, the fuselage halves are full halves. Surprising to me opening this kit is that the fuselage half and the float are all together in one, so you can imagine the seam work that had to be done in there. But here in the instructions, they're your basic monogram and Revell instructions. They go through the kit pretty simply and just piece it together one by one and you're good to go. I gotta say, I think that Revell and Monogram have the instructions on point. I think that they're the easiest instructions to read. Tommy's instructions, I get looped around a little bit. And same thing with Edward and different kits like that. So I gotta say that the instructions are definitely like, they're stupid proof. But you can see both versions there, and we're gonna go ahead and build this blue one. So this is a standard procedure for me to paint these this interior here. I painted it with a little bit of Leho interior green with a little bit of yellow mixed in. I just wanted a little bit of contrast to the blue. Once that's painted and all the interior's done, I can go ahead and actually I'm gonna put some rivets on this to accent and highlight most of the details on the kit. This isn't a necessary step to make this model realistic. It's just a fun one that I tried to do a few years ago, and it really helped this kit kind of stand out. So I just put the Tamiya tape down and go over each thing with a piece of tape and pencil it in with a pencil, and then I use this riveting tool I got from Amazon and press really hard into the lines and just scribe each line. So this didn't take quite as long as I had actually anticipated. Doing each fuselage piece and each wing only took like 30 minutes each. So it only took like 3 hours worth of work total. And honestly, it was so worth it because there's not a lot of detail in these kits, and doing these small little things that take 2 or 3 hours, it's really worth it in the end, and it makes your model stand out towards the rest. So I just put little tape lines everywhere and trace the tape, and then use the riveting tool to rivet those details in. Any rivets that were misplaced or put in place that were not really in the right line, I could fill in with some Tamiya plastic putty and just wipe away with water. It's a really easy fix and not too big of a deal at all. This tool comes with 3 different attachments, and I use the smallest attachment just because if you're looking at a 48 scale kit or a real airplane together, you're really not going to actually see panel lines or rivets, but no, both actually sometimes. But to do this detail, it just makes a lot of sense to me if there isn't a lot of surface detail. This is the first time I've had to assemble a wing together first, push it into the center of the fuselage, and then put the second half of the fuselage over, and this is actually following the instructions. Now there's 2 little tabs for this propeller. I glued on with some Tamiya glue. There weren't a lot of seams in this kit as it was a pretty well designed kit, but for the few that were, I put some Tamiya plastic putty onto a little spoon there and then wiped off the excess with a damp cloth. Any putty that got into any of the panel lines could then be scraped away with a pick. Now I'm just pre-painting the windscreens to emulate the fact that there is interior paint on the underside. It's a good little trick, and it makes it a lot easier than taping the inside of the cockpit. Now I can sand out all my other seams and surface areas that need sanding and get on to the rest of the build. I'm using 1200 grit sandpaper to sand out all of these edges, and basically all I'm doing is just making sure that the surfaces meet up perfectly. It was a really good fit on all these surfaces. I barely had to do any sanding at all. What you see here actually is all the sanding that I did. So that just goes to show that this kit was very well engineered and there wasn't a lot to be done. I carefully sanded the top seams as they are the most obvious and most noticeable when it comes down to photographing this kit. And honestly, I think this is probably my best work I've ever done in any seams. They didn't show back up at all, and you can barely tell, and there's no ghost seams either. So this worked out nice just using just your good old Tamiya glue and some 1200 grit sandpaper. And you just sand it for hours and hours and hours, and then eventually the seam goes away and you're good to go. Now I'm just showing this process just because you can start to tell and see the seam start to vanish on this particular part. So I just wanted to show that just to give you a brief idea of what it actually took to get the seam to not show up. I'm just going back and forth between 600 grit and 1200 grit actually. That sponge is a 600 grit piece of sandpaper, and this is a 1200 grit piece of sandpaper here. And I'm just going back and forth, just knocking down that big ledge and then getting that seam perfectly sanded out. Now I'm using some olive drab Vallejo surface primer to just go over the rest of the model kit and prime all this plastic. At this point in my modeling career, I actually never thinned out any of my paint as it had better coverage and also it better adhesion when I put it on the plastic. So I didn't bother to do any mixing or dulling down of the paint at this point. But now I'm going ahead and doing some gray primer over all these areas to make sure all of my seams are covered up. Again, at this point in my modeling, I didn't use any thinning or anything like that to thin out my paints, as I believed at that point in time it had better adhesion, but that's just untrue. I still apply thin light coats to the areas in order to make it a nice paint job. I use Vallejo's Insignia White to coat the underside of this underbelly. This is kind of the first stage of its weathering, as this paint is kind of like a creamy white rather than a pure white like my other whites are. So this is just my first stage of weathering, basically, is this Insignia White. Now I'm going to advise against this step here. Do not use Silica putty on your models, especially this brand. This gravity takes hold of it very easily, even though it's really easy to mold and really easy to stick on your model, and it really actually works good. It tends to droop over the course of an hour or 2 hours. So if you're letting this thing dry and then you're going to put another coat on, you're talking 3 hours of model painting, and this thing actually sags down to the floor. So you don't want to use this stuff. Honestly, this is my first attempt. I wanted a cheap solution to something I didn't want to buy online, and it worked, but it didn't work that good. You know what I'm saying? It was a pain in the butt because it did end up drooping. But here I'm painting an intermediate blue color on the rest of the model, as this whole thing is the same color. And this is a really intricate process of just making sure all of my layers are nice and even and smooth, and just putting the paint down where it needs to be. Not too much and not too little. As I'm going to do a lot of different weathering techniques after I'm actually done painting this. I do different techniques every single time I model. I don't stick to one thing. I don't think one thing is better or worse than the other, to be honest. So this way I'm going about weathering the model after I paint, because that just gives it a different effect. It gives it a different light. If I did the same weathering method to every single one of my models, I would end up with the same result, and that's kind of not what I'm trying to do. I want sunspots. I want faded panel lines. I want some darker areas, and I feel like if I set up all my models next to each other, they would all look the same because the same weathering technique would be applied to them. So what I did here was I just put some light gray splotches after I had actually put on the regular color. This gives it a nice textured mottling look, as opposed to all my other models that were kind of done the same. So I just wanted to change it up here. I'm using a Posh airbrush to do the step 0.3 millimeter tip, and I just go around the whole model in nice, even and uneven, splotchy mottling coats. Now let's get on with the decals. So the decals are Revell and Monogram quality. No issues with them whatsoever. None of them silvered or anything like that. And all I use is Microsol and Microset to put them on. And as typical Monogram and Revell decals, these are super thick, but not so thick that you notice them. So the white is actually not see-through. And that's just extremely hard to do with decals, because usually the whites are always see-through. I always dip my decals in warm water before use, as it activates the glue that's underneath them. Once they're a tiny bit loose, I pull them out of the water and let them sit for a couple minutes. I prep the surface by spreading around the Microset on the areas that the decal will be applied. Then apply the decal, and then apply the Microsol. Now I move on to the weathering stage. Here I'm just using black enamel to weather the whole model, and I just use some mineral spirits to take off all this enamel. This is the first step of the weathering stage on this model kit, as I didn't do any pre-shading or post-shading, so I just wanted to really dirty up the area to make sure that it looked nice. Now, I would advise going against this tip here. On any white surface, you want to limit your decaling to certain areas, as it is there's so much contrast between dark and white that it can almost be too dirty when you get down to it. So I had to wipe my model off a lot. But now we can move on to the next stage, which is some rust effects, since this was a saltwater bird. Now, I know that aluminum doesn't rust, but let me just say this. I've seen airplane parts in the flesh that have rusted. So they're corroded and crappy, and so what ended up happening with this rust color is I mixed all three of those together on each area, and what ended up happening is it actually made a type of corrosion type of look. So that was a really cool effect that I didn't even mean to do. I was just blending stuff and putting it on and doing different things with it and brushing it off, and it ended up making it look kind of sandy and dirty and nasty and rusted a little tiny bit, but the actual image of this thing online, it was beat to crap. I mean, it was just beat to crap. Now I put a matte varnish on it. This locks in all the decals, and it locks in all the weathering effects I did. It also makes the different types of paints that flash and kind of battle against each other, it dulls those out to a happy medium. So it makes the model look 100% flush. Now I can finally peel the tape off the canopy and see how this came out. One tip as being a painter, you always want to have a matte or flat coat on top of canopies or any tape surface, as gloss coats will tend to peel on you. But if you put a matte coat on, it almost never peels unless you try to make it peel. Now I'm putting on the flying wire. This is Easy Line I got offline, if that made sense. It's basically a really long rubber string, and the stuff lasts forever. I apply it with some really thin CA to various spots, and I try to wrap it around a surface as it gets a nice hook on that antenna. Once it's dried, I can go ahead and take a knife and cut off the access wire. And there you go. That is the model kit. Now I just want to appreciate everyone that tuned into this video and watched this awesome build. This is a great little kit if you wanted to get your hands on one aftermarket, and honestly, it just was a great little fun airplane. I just really liked this airplane at the time and still do. It sits great on my shelf, and I just appreciate every single viewer and YouTuber out there that helps me with tips, and I'm able to help with tips, as this is just such a fun hobby that I get to share and enjoy with you guys. So thank you guys so much for tuning in and watching, and enjoy these last photo shoots, and I will see you in the next one. Let's get back to building.